Hi everybody, Tim Gordon here. I'm coming to you today, not from Central California, where I normally podcast Rules for Retrogrades with my brother Dave, but from Southern California. We're here in Orange County, right outside, just a couple miles from Children's Hospital of Orange County, one of the finer hospitals here in California. And we're doing some tests. Everything's okay. For over the next couple days, I just thought I would check in with all of you, patrons and otherwise, people in Retrograde Nation, because, we didn't do a video on Wednesday. Dave and I have been crazy busy with writing deadlines. We turned in the manuscript for the feminism book, finalizing the review edits of Rules for Retrogrades, the book, which will be out sooner in March. And both of our families had crazy colds, which a monster cold, worst I've ever had without a fever, lasted 2 weeks, and both our families had that. So together with the Christmas and New Year holiday, then the wake of that, some writing deadlines, and now 5 or 6 days worth of tests. We're staying in a hotel here in Orange County. It's been crazy, and I thought I'd hit everybody, every subscriber out there with some thoughts, some ruminations on the theology of suffering. Because if I'm being perfectly honest, I was talking to an old law school buddy of mine just this morning on text when I was in the hospital. And I was saying, I feel a bit different than I used to feel when, we spent a great deal of time in the Children's Hospital of San Diego when I was in law school. Was in bad headspace. Abby was young, 1, 2, 3. We'd just gotten back from Italy. I just had decided to, pursue the law degree after having put aside the PhD. Let me tell you, people, so much suffering, so much anxiety nonstop. I would walk around dizzy. I was in bad headspace. My buddy Paul and I were talking. He was recalling that I went into the first semester of law school. He was recalling crim law class where I was taking notes on the foot shield padding from when they clean your car real thoroughly. I was just taking notes on that. Everyone else had their fancy iMacs or whatever, the MacBooks, whatever. I think some early iPads. I was just taking notes on that because we had Abby in and out of hospitals. We didn't know what was going on with her. And I was suffering tremendously. The whole family was back when, at that point, when I started law school, we only had 1 kid, Abby. Now we have 6. So looking back those 10 years, it's over 10 years now since I started law school, I was dizzy walking around the campus there in San Diego. I was stultified, barely made it through classes. Through the graces of God, I just kind of phoned it in and functioned based on, a little bit of study and a lot of bit of prayer and some natural interest and knowledge that I already took into the study of the constitutional law. It was a crazy time. And 10 years later, haven't had a lot of stays in children's hospitals over the last 8 years. Was the last major surgery Abby had. And it's interesting because when I teach church history, when one consults the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity under Emperor Constantine in the Roman Empire, and events like it in history, right? Christian ease goes like this. It's an inverse correlation, like a sine graph, with regard to the ease of practicing the Christian faith. And whenever the ease is at a high part, right, like the Edict of Milan made Christianity legal for the first time in the first 300 years of Christianity, spirituality plummets. In other words, spiritual aridity or dryness plummets. I was just talking to a buddy of mine yesterday that I teach with, and he was saying, the podcast's great. You got 2 books coming out. How's everything going? Are you happy with it? Yes, of course. But since I've been doing this the last year and a half with Taylor Marshall, seeing you guys doing more talks than I was doing even before, paid to go around the country and talk to people, go on shows like Matt Fradd's show or whatever. Aridity sets in, the ease of the Christian life, when you're having some successful talks and maybe, Rules for Retrograde subscribers out there, you all appreciate what we're trying to do, and we appreciate that. But in turn, aridity ascends. And that's what I notice, having not been in so many children's hospitals where I suffered just, like Dante Alighieri says, the canker on the human heart that must be cut from the Christian heart is the attempt to avoid suffering. I'll talk about that in a second. That the Christian is the one man on earth that does not attempt to avoid suffering. It doesn't mean you borrow needless suffering, but we're the one kind of human being that does not flee from suffering because it unites us to Christ on the cross. Nevertheless, I bring up church history and the inverse correlation of Christian thriving to Christian aridity because of this correlation, this cross correlation. When we fail to suffer, a lot of times dryness sets in. And that's how I answered both my friends who I've cited in this talk. I told them, yeah, it's funny. Since things have been a little bit easier, not so many super frequent health challenges with Abby, aridity set in a little bit over the course of the last year. And it's an interesting thing. So in church history, after the Edict of Milan, like I said, like a sign graph, there are several points in Christian history when Christians thrive, and yet they have to flee to the deserts because their spiritual lives are shrinking up. This makes me think of the relationship between suffering and theology, and it's natural. All the other world religions, I think culminating with Buddhism, not to pick on Buddhism, have this kind of canker on the heart that Dante Alighieri describes. The canker on the heart is the flight, the fleeing from suffering. And the Christian says this is an opportunity to be Christ-like. Well, the Buddhist, think about what Buddhism is. It's an identification in life with the root cause of suffering as desire. This doesn't mean sexual desire or the desire for food. It means all desire, the genus term. Any kind of desire, first principle of practical reason, where one thinks that the object of their desire will make them happy, right? And so Buddhism says life is suffering. Suffering comes from desire. Therefore, cease all desire, enter this state of nirvana where all desire has been cut from the heart of man. And then you'll be happy, or the equivalent. Now, it's not eudaimonia. It's not true happiness. It's false religion. This is the number one mark of man-made religion, is the primary goal here in Buddhism is wrong. It's a wrong cant, a wrong angle on human happiness. Human happiness, we know from the one true faith, Roman Catholicism, we know the Aristotelian truth that all of the desires are, when they're rightly ordered, they will all lead to eudaimonia. All of the natural ones necessarily get us to eudaimonia, happiness, and especially the fondest desire of the heart, which is the desire for the good, which has something not indefinite to do with the finding and the obedience to God, the obedience before God. But I hate to pick on Buddhism. I actually don't. But as kind of the leading false religion in the history of the world, Buddhism says the exact opposite of the Aristotelian philosophy of not suffering, but of desire, rightly ordered desire. Thomas Aquinas picks up on this. He says all rightly ordered desires are good and to be encouraged. Conversely, Buddhism, polytheism number 9,000 or whatever in the history of all the world's polytheisms, with only 3 monotheisms, is nihilism. It says essentially annihilate all of your desire, which is really what all of your will is geared to do, is to do properly ordered desires and habits. It says, nihilism. All of a sudden, you take Buddhism seriously, and then you're taking the claims of nihilism as if they're good. It's all an attempt, and all the other polytheisms do them too. Secular humanism does it too, to avoid suffering, because suffering's horrible. It's awful. When one is going through it, the attempt to get back to a normal, to return oneself to a semi-comfortable state or a comfortable state of existence, becomes the fondest desire of the heart, right? All I want is how I was, this time of the day yesterday, or this time of the year last year. Well, this is the primary challenge of Christianity in a whole host of, if we're talking about Hinduism now, and Gandhi, who criticized Roman Catholicism bitterly when he said, I'd become a Christian the moment I ever met one Christian on earth. I don't believe they exist. He's using something called the perfectionist fallacy, just to show, look, it's the tallest order ever. Not only do we have the single non-man-made fundamental theology, biblical theology, scriptural theology, moral theology, dogmatic theology, but we also have the one theology in the history of all the fake world religions, the man-made ones, that gets a theology of suffering correct. How does it do so? It says, let's just imagine, put yourself in the mind of a first century Roman Empire Jew that is going to be assessing the claims of this other Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, who says, we're reasoning from, John's gospel and the books of Paul. Jesus says, really, I am God. I am the second person of the Blessed Trinity. I'm the divine Son of God. I'm not just God-like. I'm God himself. My incarnation bears with it the meaning of all of your struggles, people. I share in the struggles of all of humanity, except in the struggle that is sin, the needless, self-imposed struggle of sin. But he shares in all the effects of sin. When Adam and Eve fell in the garden in Genesis chapter 2, what happened is we went from a state of natural justice, right? Where if this side is, being oriented at perfect virtue easily, and this side of the spectrum, of the semicircle spectrum, is, total depravity, which is what Protestants believe, then we were oriented somewhere about here, right? In a state of original justice, where it was that much easier to do justice naturally, to do the right thing, to do virtue. Now, after we've been oriented the other way, after the fall, thank you very much, Adam and Eve, we're oriented mostly toward depravity, which is why it's easy to get a bad habit. It's tough to get a good habit. Easy to break a glass vase, hard to make a glass vase, etc. This is called the state of concupiscence. In the state of concupiscence, after sin, there's a piper to pay. There's a wage that has to be tendered. What's that wage? It's the following things: suffering, sickness, toil, and death. Suffering, sickness, toiling, and death. Jesus shared in all of these things. The God-man. Again, imagine putting yourself in the mind frame of a first century Roman Empire Jew. He says, Yahweh's the one true God. The Old Testament is all true. However, what you didn't know, Jews of the first century and before, is that God is a triune God. There are three persons. I'm the second person of the Trinity. And I am this God-man, and I share with you people, I share all things, all the effects of original sin. I just don't share in original sin or actual sin. It's a very, very unfair deal for Jesus, needless to say, right? I mean, he shares in the effects. He doesn't share in any of the fun of sin as you do it. Or he has none of the stain of original sin, but he's taking on our nature enough to suffer with us. What's the purpose of that? So Jesus, the first century Jew, is killed around 33, 34 AD, but he's not just killed, right? He is tortured. One of the all-time worst instances, best recorded instances of a famous person of being tortured, scourged nearly to death, and then having the crown of thorns shoved deep into his skull, ridiculed by the Roman soldiers, and then killed, put to death in a particularly excruciating way. Excruciation coming from the term to be crucified. Wow. So, I mean, consider that. Jesus shared in suffering, not sickness, but the kind of infirmity of the body that was happening when he was having spikes driven through his hands, right? The kind of infirmity that one suffers when one is crucified to the pulmonary system in the lungs. He suffered all of the worst aspects of being human outside of the moral theology. This is noteworthy. It sticks out. It's sui generis in yet one more way. Christianity, the one true faith, is sui generis among, let's say, 10,000 fake world religions, man-made world religions. It's sui generis in all these ways, in the way that being the truth against falsity is always sui generis. It's always one of a kind. But this is yet one more way. The theology of suffering works like this. And imagine me, a young man with a first daughter, being petrified for some months out in a foreign country, Rome, Italy, with my daughter being born there and eventually giving up a PhD, coming back to the States, continuing to have those neurological problems, epilepsy with a daughter, multiple brain surgeries, trying to go through law school. It was a really tough time. I would hear students pissing and moaning about, making an a B plus instead of an A minus, and I had to scoff because I was going through a legitimately gut-wrenching time, and my wife's deaf and our young daughter. So the theology of suffering works like this, and I don't know why the trick is tricky, but the trick is this. When you're going through whatever you're going through, all the parents I saw this morning at Chalk, in the waiting room, they're all suffering in a similar way. Distinction of degree. Some people have really hard stuff. Some people have less hard stuff. But it's genuinely gut-wrenching to see your kid in this situation. The trick in here is in real time. You can't do it subsequently. To give the suffering to Christ and to say, I unite myself with Jesus on the cross. And all that matters is that you do it contemporaneous with the actual experience of the pain. For whatever reasons, physical pain makes it, a bigger challenge. Talk to chronic back pain sufferers, that'll have 2 months of relentless pain. Or, multiple sclerosis sufferers that get the pain in the limbs. They feel like their limbs are on fire. Something like that, physical pain, makes it really tough to do in real time, but you have to try. I mean, that's how uniting oneself with Christ on the cross works. That's the purpose of it. When you're experiencing emotional, spiritual pain, when you're tempted to go to the little chapel in the hospital, for whatever reason, there's a greater openness to the suffering. The canker on the heart described by Dante it's not there, it's there in lesser quantity, because people, you look around, you look into the eyes of any parent that's ever had a kid in a kid's hospital, or you look into the eyes of someone, a back patient that's just had surgery and is out of pain, but now realizes they've got a lot of PT out of them. They probably feel the dryness from not having prayed much, assuming that they were experiencing aridity when they were in the spiked pain. And then the knowledge is self-evident, or almost self-evident, that there's an openness at a certain point to uniting oneself with Jesus on the cross. And that this is what perhaps the meaning of the incarnation was. As Archbishop Fulton Sheen used to say, all the fake religions, he might put it a little nicer than I do, but all the world's fake religions were a faulty, spurious attempt of man down here, down below, to go up to God. Whereas Christianity, the one true religion, is God coming down, making himself manifest to man. And more than that, participating in humanity in an ontological sense, actually participating in what it is to be a human. So the meaning of suffering is unitive. It unifies us with Christ, not just from our action I should be like Jesus on the cross. I should be like Veronica when she wiped the face of Jesus. I should be like, the Virgin Mary when she picked up her boy when he would trip on the ground. I should be like St. John, the single non-martyred saint who was actually there, present at the foot of the cross. But it's also Jesus, in the divine mind, making himself available for such unification first. It's a two-part action. By the way, one thing that I dawned on me when I was lecturing my class the other day that I'd never thought about is something that's interesting about St. John, the single non-apostolic martyr, is that he is the one guy that put it all on the line, took a risk to be present for Christ during his great passion and suffering. And think about the other 10 of 11 remaining apostles at the time. Why were they incentivized to not show up at the foot of the cross in the first place? Probably to avoid martyrdom, right? So the irony's thick. He who would save his life shall lose it, and he who is willing to lose his life thereby saves it. Luckily for those other 10 of the 11 apostles, they got tough later at the Pentecost. But St. John was himself sui generis insofar as he was willing to take a risk for this Christly suffering and put himself out there. I mean, perhaps it's because he was the beloved apostle. We don't know why. But even before the descent of the Holy Spirit at the Pentecost, he was willing to put it on the line, and thereby he's the one guy that, taking a risk of martyrdom, wasn't martyred. I always, from here on out, I'm going to think of that as a bit of divine justice. The other 10 that, phoned it in that day, called in sick. Sorry, Jesus, I can't be with you at the foot of the cross. These guys are going to have to suffer their martyrdom later. John put it on the line that day, the day of, Good Friday. So the theology of suffering is profound, because more or less is what people really care about. The pursuit of pleasure, yes, as Aristotle says, but it's not as intent as the flight from pain and from suffering. So there's something cosmologically, ontologically telling in the fact that Jesus, when he came down, he would do so in a way that would avail him later for all of the Christian generations until he comes again in glory, to unite themselves to. He was a referent for them to refer to. And the beautiful ones, the good ones, the loving ones, the good Christians would do so. Something very telling in that. Now, so as I wrap up here, I just thought I would say, please do bear with us, Rules for Retrogrades. We'll be back next week. We got Jesse Romero. I did a tweet earlier today. I've been reading his book, Devil in the City of Angels, and it's a great read. Everyone should go out and get a copy. It's a tan book. So we're going to have Jesse on. That interview is slated for next Friday. You can tune in. We'll have either one other interview or the standard 3 shows at any rate next week. We hope to hit and hit 2020 New Year's schedule and be right on from here on out once I get back from the hospital. But I thought that this, look back on me 10 years ago hanging out more than I'd prefer in children's hospitals, and the contrasting picture of me now in a children's hospital in 2020, not in law school. It's nice not to be doing those two things at the same time anymore. But there are likenesses, there are stark memories, and there are contrasting differences, and they're welcome ones because things are a little easier now. But it does remind me that aridity always comes from comfort. People out there, remember when Constantine signed the Edict of Milan and made Christianity not only legal but easy, even popular within the Roman Empire after 300 years of pure red martyrdom, subterranean Christianity. They couldn't be out in the light of day. Things grew easy for the Christians, but right away, what did you see? You had Saint Anthony and the Desert Fathers movement fleeing to the deserts and the caves because of this inverse correlation. And it's worth taking note of, even if you don't, let's say you don't care about church history much, even though it's instructive past his prologue. Let's say you have no interest in that. It's of genuine interest in the life of every Christian, because one ought to know to be vigilant and look out for it. In a time of great comfort and ease, I will tend toward spiritual sloth. In a time of great physical pain, physical pain, like I said about back sufferers, I might actually tend toward the same direction, spiritual sloth. But in a time of acute emotional and spiritual pain, there's a kind of aperture, an opening that will be affected in my own soul, and I should take advantage of that. I should seize upon these opportunities when I'm suffering, or I'm just walking around struggling to keep it together, as I was with Abby in children's hospitals in San Diego 10 years ago, starting out law school, just feeling sick with it, overwhelmed with my life and the state of the whole constellation of things in the world. There's an opening there that makes me take time out of my day to be self-unimportant, to interrupt whatever I think is so important that I'm doing in the day, and stop by in the chapel. You do that less in the sunlight. As Fulton Sheen often said, the sunshine, happy days. Yes, God's there for us, but unlike the other religions, Christianity is not just the faith for the sunshine, happy days. It's especially potent when we need Him. Oftentimes, every time when we're looking to Christ, He's there to meet the gaze. But think about Jesus on Good Friday, over 2,000 years ago. He only had a couple people there, his mother and a couple friends there to meet his gaze when he was suffering from the cross. A 2 to 3 hour death after being tortured all morning. Boy, the incarnation has something stark to do with suffering. And anyway, again, I just want to say I've tweeted about this before. My people, I feel like our tribe, Steph feels this way too, is parents with kids in and out of the hospital with any kind of physical ailment that's persistent, beyond a stubbed toe or whatever. It's a whole distinction of degree. We have it easier than a lot. We do. Even, being in and out of surgery. Some people have it really tough. And just by being in the hospital so much, we've come into contact with people that have some of these really particularly hard stories. These people need your prayers, even if they're nameless and faceless. And people out there that DM me or email me or text me that have experienced this stuff, childhood leukemia or even worse. God bless you all. And we think of not only our case, not only Christ's case on the cross when we're in the children's hospital, but we think of your case as well. And, God be with all of us. God be with all of us. That's the point. And thank you all for the well-wishings and the love that's been sent, even, through Twitter. We appreciate it duly. So next week we'll have Jesse Romero talking about his book. And it's a good book. I encourage everyone to go get it. Tan Books. Speaking of Tan, our book, Rules for Retrogrades on Tan, will be out in March. We're doing final edits, and it's going to print soon. We just turned in the manuscript for the feminism book, got held up writing it a little bit. We're going to go through rigorous edits there, so it might be a little slow, but we're getting this stuff done. The work product feels better on the way out than beginning it. Anyway, God bless you all. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be back with you next week. Peace.